Good morning, Henryville. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. A few preliminary comments before we resume on interest groups and political parties. Number one, we are still talking about political processes, and this section of the course will end with Chapter 9 when we talk about campaigns and elections at the end of this month. And then we'll be moving into governmental institutions. I think I said the same thing last time. Secondly, we will have class tomorrow at 9:45, and we will be dealing with political parties. There is one video available, and I will start either on slide 12 or wherever we leave off today, if it's further along than slide 12, in the political party PowerPoint. Number 3, watch for the announcements over the break. There will be some. You will be responsible for checking the announcements a couple times a week to make sure that you're doing what you need to be doing. I will be trying to put together a calendar for the rest of the term over the break. Reminder, your paper is due on March 18th. Again, let me emphasize that the point of the paper is not to express a political opinion about gay marriage, either for or against or neutral, but rather to look at the governmental and political processes and actors who have been involved in a significant way in the policy changes that have occurred and in the opposition to those policy changes. So it's not about the issue itself, it's about who's doing what, who's winning, who's losing, where is the change, who is making the change, how is the change made, what the significance is for our understanding of the federal system. That is the purpose of the paper. Please don't lose sight of that. And again, on March 31st, we will be meeting at 9:45, and we will be taking up Chapter 9, campaigns, elections, and so on. So today I want to finish with interest groups and perhaps start political parties if there are no questions. Are there any questions before I begin?
No.
Thank you. I guess not, so I'll start. One of the things to keep in mind when we're looking at interest groups and when you're doing your paper, for that matter, is the participation of social movements in the political process. I've listed here some social movements in relatively recent American history, and they do have can have a significant impact in policy outcomes and and political processes, and you need to be aware of that and keep that in mind in general and with specific reference to your upcoming papers that's due. I want to talk a good bit about lobbyists today. Lobbyists tend to get a bad name, as I've already suggested, that they're being associated with interest groups. For at least 70 years, the federal government has been involved in trying to regulate lobbying at the national level. The regulations have been pretty modest and have been only marginally successful in curbing the unchecked power of lobbyists and interest groups. In 2007, we have one of the more recent efforts at regulating lobbying and lobbyists that comes out of the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives in 2007, and also the passage of the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act. And in 2011, when the Republicans were in control of the House, they banned, at least in theory, targeted earmarks. Nonetheless, one of the measures of interest group lobbying and lobbying success, and one of the measures of the limits of a distinction between interest groups on the one hand and governmental institutions on the other, is what's called the revolving door. And the revolving door is a term that's used to describe the career moves of members of Congress, both prior and sometimes the executive branch, both prior to and subsequent to their public service in the national government. So OpenSecrets.org is one of the premier websites for aggregating data about interest group behavior, about interest groups, about their impact on the political process, and on the revolving door. That is, the movement between the quote-unquote public sector and government office on the one hand, and taking interest group related positions as lawyers, lobbyists, consultants, strategists, senior executives in major corporations, and so on. And this is the website where you can examine the various examples, recent examples, and even historic examples of this revolving door. There's also a featured revolving door candidate, and the most recently featured one is the new Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, in the Obama administration. This is, by the way, a nonpartisan website, and it examines the interest group ties of candidates and office holders of both parties. One that I wanted to examine briefly this morning as a case study of the revolving door is former Vice President Dick Cheney. The way a revolving door case can work is as follows. First, one achieves a high-level position in the government, and one then has can initiate, have an impact on the awarding of huge government contracts for services or products. Keep in mind that we mentioned in an earlier class that over 12, maybe 13 million people are working under contract for the federal government, but are not formal government employees. And so the history of American government, whether at the city level or at the state level or at the national level, is in some measure impacted by and reflects the government awarding of contracts. So one takes a high position in a company, one moves from government, takes a position in a company that is a potential recipient of these lucrative contracts, and you stay in touch with your colleagues and friends in government to ensure that future contracts come your way. In return, you then offer political contributions to those candidates and agencies that are that have awarded you the contract. Sometimes for political candidates that will come in terms of campaign contributions. Sometime with regard to non-candidate office holders, it will be other forms of political support. So at age 34, Dick Cheney was chief of staff for President Ford in the 1970s. He was then elected to Congress subsequently and served for 11 years until he became Secretary of Defense under President Bush I. After serving in the Bush administration, he then went to he and his wife both went to the American Enterprise Institute, which is a policy think tank associated with the Republican Party for the most part, and then became CEO and chairman of a major oil services company, Halliburton, in 1995. Subsequently, the United States was involved in military action in Panama and the Balkans and Somalia and the Gulf War, and companies like Brown and Root, which was a subsidiary of Halliburton, was hired to go in and build and or repair bases, bridges, utilities, roads, airports, and infrastructure of all kinds. Dick Cheney was the CEO of Halliburton at the time, and so one of his subsidiary companies was also involved in building oil field installations, but they began to shift focus to rebuilding war-torn countries. And in fact, Brown and Root became the #1 contractor in this business, and it appears that their services will be needed, at least in the Middle East, indefinitely. So when Vice President Cheney became Vice President, he had to leave his position as CEO of Halliburton, and when he did that, he received a $34 million payout, and then you can see, based on the Vice President's own filings with the federal government, the bonuses, the salaries, the deferred salaries, the compensation, the $21 million plus in stock option income, and all the rest that he was earning once he became Vice President. Keep in mind that he was earning that from a company that was intimately involved in the activities that we just spoke about. So as the period of his incumbency, as his service as Vice President, the Halliburton stock options that he was being paid in his deferred compensation became more and more valuable. And so the Financial Times, again, a newspaper, a nonpartisan, found that energy-focused engineering and construction firm KBR, which was spun off from Halliburton, received almost $40 billion in Iraq-related contracts, in most of them during the time he was serving as Vice President. So one of the major changes, anyway, that's an example of revolving door. I'm not picking on Dick Cheney. There are literally scores of public officials in the Congress and in the executive branch who move back and forth between private sector and public sector positions. One example, a recent example from the Obama administration, is the former head of the Office of Management and Budget for President Obama, arguably one of the most important executive branch jobs in American government. He eventually left the Obama administration and took a senior level position with Citigroup, one of the largest financial services firms in the country. It's another example. As I said, there are scores of examples. One of the arguments I'd like to make is that interest groups and their role have changed. And one of the major changes is the emergence of huge amounts of money in American national government. And I'd like to give you one case study of that. Understand this is merely one case study, and that this is by no means It may be the biggest example, but it's not the only example. So the first question is, why is so much money flooding into American politics and into political campaigns? Well, one of the reasons is the 2010 Supreme Court decision, which we'll talk about later on, which struck down a number of campaign spending limits, even those on corporations. But some of the other factors to be considered are as follows. First, information technology and its application in campaign and political fundraising. The growing wealth and political resources of major corporations. They're sitting on huge stockpiles of cash, much of which is in banks and financial institutions outside the United States. The growing high levels of inequality in our country, and the fact that a small handful of people actually are so incredibly wealthy that they can spend millions of dollars to influence electoral and policy electoral outcomes and not even miss the millions of dollars. There are new trends in interest group organization, which I'm going to describe to you. And we've been in a fairly long period of divided government, and there's been significant geographic and demographic change with respect to how that's affected electoral outcomes. So the case I want to present to you is the one that's perhaps most discussed in the media, and that's the Koch brothers. Because what the Koch brothers have done is, and this is one of the large amounts of money they're spending is one issue. Another is that they've created a large national interest group network based on their own corporate activity, but going well beyond it. So, first, who are the Koch brothers? What businesses are they in? Well, you can see here they're in the oil and energy industry, the chemical industry, in polymers, the fiber, pulp, paper, packaging, minerals, fertilizer, ranching, and commodities trading. So they're very active in a number of major industries in the country. And these are some of the many corporations that are part of the Koch Industries conglomerate. A conglomerate is a corporate form which holds a number of and a diversity of businesses within its framework. So United Technologies is another example of a conglomerate, company that's a conglomerate. There are a number of them. General Electric would be another. So these are some of their companies. And what can we say about their industry? First, their company. First, the conglomerate itself is the second largest privately held company in the United States. They're not on the stock market. It's called Koch Industries. Its revenues in 2013, 2 years ago, were about $115 billion. The Koch brothers themselves are worth minimum of $85 billion and very possibly more than $100 billion. That's billion. That's billion. The total Indiana state budget in 2014 was $30 billion. So between the two of them, their net worth is more than 3 times what the state of Indiana spends in an entire calendar year. The companies associated with Koch Industries have received over $154 million in federal and state subsidies since 1990. That's $154 million. They are the largest holders of land in Alberta. They hold more than 1.1 million acres. They have large interests in the Keystone Pipeline project and tar sands oil fields. They operate in 60 countries. They have 100,000 employees. And you can see here that the state of Indiana had 29,000 employees in 2010. Koch Industries, again, well more than 3 times as many employees. Just to give you a sense of the size and scope of Koch Industries. These are some of the products that are produced and sold by Koch Industries. Some of them may be pretty familiar: Vanity Fair napkins and paper towels, Angel Soft tissue, American Greetings, Dixie products. Probably a lot of you have paper cups in your home. They make them, and so you can see some of the products that they're involved in. They also have, and this is less discussed in the media, but I thought it was useful to point out, they have set up a number of charitable foundations, which very, very, very wealthy people sometimes do. You've heard of the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I'm sure. So they have a number of charitable foundations. And actually, I have personal experience of at least one of those foundation's gifts, and I'll share it in a minute. So these are some of the philanthropic activities totaling in medical and cancer research about $280 million that the Koch brothers foundations have contributed to a variety of institutions, at hospitals in New York City, Johns Hopkins, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, one in New York, one in Houston, Mount Sinai Medical Center. So they've contributed, again, about $280 million for medical and cancer research over the course of their life. And again, they do this through the foundations. They also support science, about $100 million or so. They fund the PBS documentary series NOVA and the Science and Tech Center at Deerfield Academy. They have contributed money to the Smithsonian for several projects, and as well as to MIT and to the American Museum of Natural History. They've also given a $65 million gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So they do philanthropic activity in the arts and culture. They've given money to Lincoln Center and to the New York City Ballet and the New York City Opera. About 2 years ago, I went to New York City and went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the whole plaza in front of it was undergoing reconstruction, and that reconstruction was being funded in large measure by David Koch, and is going to be called the David H. Koch Plaza. It was not finished when I was last there. So there are a number of organizations, or what might be called think tanks or lobbying groups or front groups, that the Koch brothers are part of the Koch brothers network and that they fund. And so these organizations scattered around the country are listed here, and the most recent data from roughly a year and a half or so ago that I was able to obtain, showing you how much money they have been contributing to these organizations. And they contribute to these policy groups because they are doing the policy relevant work for the Koch brothers. They're developing policy ideas, they're networking, they're lobbying, and so on. So it's not as though the Koch brothers go out to Washington every day and sit in senators' or congressmen's offices. They have employees of various groups all over the country to do that work for them, just as they have 100,000 people working for them in their various companies that they own. So these are some of the organizations, and there are more of the organizations, and here are more of the organizations. So I don't know how many that is, but it's looks like it could be as many as 50 different organizations, plus or minus, that they're contributing to. One of the major ones here is the Heritage Foundation, $4.5 million. And so these organizations are substantially dependent upon the largesse and contributions of the Koch brothers or their foundations. So this is an image from Open Secrets that tries to explore what this network of, or at least a piece of their network, organizational or interest group network, looks like. It's very complex. There are many, many organizations and groups that are part of it, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And you can see that that what they've put together is not one organization, but two brothers who have, essentially unlimited amounts of money, who are then able to create, or to get other people to create, organizations and groups and interest groups to do their policy relevant lobbying and work. So the Koch network is very much associated with the Republican Party. There are other networks, and we'll talk about those. The reason I'm looking at this one is that they are by far the largest and most extensively developed network. This is where, under at least as things currently stand, this is where interest group politics is going. And the reason it's going that way is because the amount of money that's being put into American national government campaigns and lobbying is so great that it will lead to other groups and other networks having to up their game to compete effectively with them. So the Koch brothers network tends to be associated with the Republican Party. There is empirical evidence to that effect, which I will show. Again, there's others that do the same thing with lesser amounts of money in the Democratic Party. They're committed to, ideologically, to small government, low taxes, opposition to all environmental protection regulation, or almost all of it. They're currently, the media spotlight is beginning to look at what the Koch brothers have been doing with, in terms of lobbying Governor Scott in Florida, where apparently the environmental agency of the state of Florida has been advised that they are not allowed to use the terms sustainability or global warming or climate change in any of their work, because these are not facts. That's what's being claimed. The Koch brothers tend to be opposed to almost all federal regulations, all social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and so on. They tend to be opposed to civil rights and women's rights and worker protection laws. They've helped finance the Tea Party and the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a national organization that works to write laws for state governments. They fund, as we already know, interest groups and think tanks that focus on lower taxes, less environmental regulation, opposition to clean energy, and easing the limits on industrial pollution. In 2014, the last, in the off-year election last year, they bought over 44,000 political ads to boost Republican efforts to take back the Senate. So they've been a big booster of the Republican Party. And here's some data from national government sources and Open Secrets on the amount of money they gave with respect to congressional candidates in 2014 and as well as some candidates from Indiana. And what you'll see is that the Koch brothers gave money to 246 Republicans and 8 Democrats, and 226 of them were in the House. And keep in mind, 226 members of the House of Representatives, if elected, is a majority. So they actually gave campaign contributions, sometimes as high as $100,000, you can see here, to Republican candidates in the House of Representatives. In Indiana, they gave candidates to the House and Senate somewhere between 20, depending on the candidate, somewhere between $2,500 and $11,000 to 8 different Indiana candidates. So they're spending nationally last year just on candidates over $1.8 million. And again, mostly but not all to Republican candidates. They also made major contributions in soft money and in lobbying, and this has to do with money that doesn't go directly to candidates, but rather goes to groups and organizations that have their own campaign apparatus and activities. So they gave over $3 million in political contributions last year, which is in the top 2% of all political contributors. And in 2013 and 14, they spent almost $16 million for lobbying. And you can see the breakdown here. Again, the source of this information is Open Secrets, which gets the information from organization and group filings with the federal government. And you can see they're giving money both to outside groups as well as to political parties and party congressional committees. So they're very active. In terms of the revolving door, we talked about that. The lobbyists for Koch Industries in 2013-14 are good examples of the revolving door between the private sector and holding government office. Almost 80% of the people who are lobbying for them in those 2 years previously held government jobs. Which means, of course, they have contacts, they know people, they have colleagues, they have friends in government, federal government agencies. Just to give you a sense of, more broadly, of the largest political spenders, again, these are from, these data are from the OpenSecrets.org. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce leads, far and away. This is in terms of last year's political spenders, over $54 million, followed by the National Association of Realtors, Blue Cross Blue Shield, the AMA, Dow Chemical, and so on. The point of this is for you to see just how much money is being moved into into the political process and into interest group, policy relevant interest group activity and lobbying. So one of the downsides of the Koch brothers is they've been involved in, or their companies have been involved in, criminal and illegal activities. going all the way back to 1974, and these data, I believe, are, yes, up through 2010. So we're looking at roughly a 35-year period where courts have fined them, where courts have found their company guilty of criminal behavior, and the list that researchers have been able to put together are indicated here. Much of this has to do with violations of environmental laws, but also questions of fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, overcharging, falsifying commodities trading, and various other things. So their companies or someone associated with their companies and a variety of acts around the country have been either pled guilty or convicted of at least 6 felonies, numerous misdemeanor convictions. I didn't even bother listing all of those, and nobody has served any jail or prison time for any of this. So what we have when we talk about interest groups is a new political landscape because of the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court 5 years ago. And so at the very time that income and wealth inequality are at a historic and all-time high in the United States, the Supreme Court has taken action to open the floodgates even more to money and to big money in the political process. They severely undercut campaign financing laws. They opened the door to unlimited contributions to parties and groups to influence the elections. And they provide dramatic new advantages to interest groups and interest group networks with piles of money. So the Koch industries, again, are just one example of corporations who are littering the political landscape with huge amounts of money, unprecedented, to both recruit and to bankroll candidates and to win elections. And in January on the West Coast, the Koch brothers had a major meeting of supporters at which they announced their plans for the 2016 elections. So let's just go back and look at this. So the largest political spender, again, just to keep in mind the scale of what's going on here. In 2014, the largest political spender in the country was the United States Chamber of Commerce at $54 million. The next was $23 million, the National Association of Realtors. Now let's look at what the Koch brothers are planning. They announced, this is not something that's made up. You can go to the New York Times, Washington Post, any number of responsible journalistic sources who reported on the meetings that the Koch brothers had with their supporters. They're planning, their network is planning to spend $889 million in the 2016 elections. This is probably about, I don't know, I can only do so much math in my head, 17 or 18 times as much as the United States Chamber of Commerce in 2014, I guess. If you convert past elections into 2014 dollars, they're planning to outspend the combined elections of 1860 through 1916, that is to say 56 years of elections. The amount they're planning to spend, $889 million, is more than either President Obama or Mitt Romney raised in 2012. It's also $300 million more than all 2012 election outside that is to say non-candidate and non-party spending, for and against all candidates in the primary and general elections in that year. And it's more than every candidate for the Senate spent combined in every election year ever. Let me clarify this. In other words, if you take all the money that every candidate for the U.S. Senate ever spent to try to get elected, it would be less, ever in our entire history, it would be less than $889 million. So this is what the landscape is beginning to look like. These are the biggest spenders. Others will come out of the woodwork. Others will organize. Others are organizing to try to, people who have, and groups and organizations that have different political views to try to counterbalance what the Koch brothers are planning and doing. Comments or questions at this time? Okay, I'm going to need a minute to create to get a new PowerPoint up here. Where did it go? Here we go. Still waiting for this to pop up on the screen. Okay, so we're going to talk about political parties. The first dozen or so slides from this lecture are available on Blackboard for Chapter 8. And you should access those at that location. I'm going to, some of this just deals with history. I'm going to start with this map. And actually, I think the available video lecture to you goes through slide 14. So there'll be a little bit of overlap. One of the reasons I wanted to start here with this map is first it shows you the map, the electoral map of the presidential election in 2012. It also has a mistake that I wanted to point out, which is there's only one mistake, and that is the West Virginia right here should be red rather than blue. You might have some questions about the map. The one thing I would point out is that there are only two states, Indiana and North Carolina, which are kind of pink. And those are the only two states that changed, that President Obama won in 2008 and lost in 2012. It was pretty close in North Carolina, less so in Indiana. So the point of this, among other things, is that there appears to be, at least in the short run, a significant amount of political stability, electoral stability, when it comes to national presidential elections, at least if we look at the last couple elections. Well, who are the Democrats and who are the Republicans? When one attempts to answer this question, one is talking about tendencies, not certainties. When one says certain groups tend to vote Democratic, it doesn't mean that they all do, that all people in that demographic do. So what we're saying is the data show that X group of people, X demographic group is more likely to vote Democratic or Republican or Democrat, and sometimes it's fairly closely divided. Democrats tend more often than not to be members of labor unions, to be women, especially single women, tend to be racial and ethnic minorities. They tend to be urbanites, people living in bigger cities, people under 30. Less educated voters as well as more educated voters. They tend to support social programs such as health care. They tend to support government management of the economy and government regulation of business. Those who vote Republican are more likely to be associated with big businesses. Rural voters, white evangelicals, they tend to support the private sector, to emphasize self-reliance and supporting yourself rather than relying on any government programs. They argue, at least in theory, that they're for limited government and states' rights. When one's looking at political parties, states, which is to say both geography and culture, are very important. In fact, let me go back to this map for a minute, just to emphasize one point about geography and states. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that in presidential elections, geography matters. When one says geography matters, one's also saying states matter. Okay? So in theory, in a presidential election, in any and every presidential election, it is not the case that the candidate with the most votes wins. It is the case that the candidate who has a majority of the Electoral College votes wins the election. So that it's possible, as was happened in the year 2000, that a candidate with the most votes nationally apparently did not receive a majority of Electoral College votes. Excuse me. States matter in presidential politics. It's not a straight Democratic vote, and in almost all the states, except two, Maine and Nebraska, the winner in a state, even if the candidate only wins by one vote, gets 100% of the Electoral College votes. So geography and culture matter a lot for political parties. One reason they do is because the state political parties are often more important and more powerful than the national party committees. There's a Democratic National Committee, there's a Republican National Committee. They're not always as well organized as some state party committees. And states and geography therefore plays a significant role in defining the parties, and as does culture and socioeconomic status. Regions also play an important part, and you can see that in the history of party politics in our country. Economic factors often play an important role in determining the political orientation excuse me, of states. So that, for example, energy states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana tend to vote more Republican. Heavy technology states like Massachusetts, Washington, California tend to vote more Democratic. Environmental states like Oregon and Vermont tend to vote Democratic. States with many Latinos, Florida and New Mexico, tend to vote Democratic. Conservative religious states like Utah and Mississippi tend to vote Republican, and so on. Some states are divided and divided in the same way in terms of urban-rural splits or upstate-downstate splits. So New York and Illinois are a good example of two states which have very large metropolitan areas, New York City in New York and Chicago in Illinois. The downstate in Illinois tends to be much more Republican than the area around Chicago. Similarly, the area around New York City tends to be much more Democratic than upstate in New York. And so there can be, while it's the case that city dwellers tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic in general, Republicans more oriented toward rural and small town areas, there can be differences and are differences within the state. So if you look at your own state, for example, Indianapolis tends to be heavily Democratic. But the small towns, with few exceptions, the smaller towns in Indiana are more likely to lean Republican. Since the late 1960s, we have been in an era of divided government. We have been in an era where one major party has not dominated national government the way the New Deal Democrats did between 1933 and 1968, for the most part. So probably the single greatest change in, say, the last 50 years in the national political national political environment with respect to the parties is the end of the solid Democratic South in the 1960s. And it's important that you understand this, because if you miss this, and a lot of people do, then you really can't understand American party politics today. So we have to go back to the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War. And the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, was largely responsible for administering, at least initially, the federal government's response to the former Confederate states. And so the Republican Party, between, say, the 1860s and for 100 years, the Republican Party for 100 years was hated in the South as a consequence. And it was very often the case that for local and state offices, Republicans couldn't even run for office. I mean, they could have, but there weren't any. to run. So up through 1960, the southern states were solidly 100% Democratic. The states as a whole. Were there a handful of Republicans in the various southern states? Yes, but they were a relative handful. And many southern congressmen and senators in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, a good number of them ran unopposed. They didn't have a serious challenge, or none at all. This began to change with the emergence of the civil rights movement as it got stronger in the 1960s. The election of President Johnson in 1964, the decision by the Democratic Party to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, rather than, which was an integrated slate of delegates to the Democratic National Convention, rather than the segregated all-white delegates from the state of Mississippi. And for the first time in modern history, a Republican candidate for president, Barry Goldwater, in 1964, actually won 5 states against President Johnson. He didn't win many others. So a slow party realignment of the southern states begins in the latter part of the 1960s. As civil rights legislation is passed, as the Democratic Party begins to open up to blacks in southern states, and to push for voting rights for African Americans, and so on. And so, bit by bit, year by year, decade by decade, more and more rank-and-file voters and more political officials from the southern states switched from the Democratic to the Republican Party. There is no other explanation for this, none, that is in any way defensible, as far as I can see, except race. No one likes to say this in public, but the fact of the matter is the National Democratic Party's support for civil rights and the success of the civil rights movement and the passage of civil rights legislation immediately is followed by the beginning of white Southerners moving from the and political officials moving from the Democratic to the Republican Party. And so the key political event for the last 50 years nationally, in some ways, in terms of the two parties, is the end of the solid Democratic South. It no longer is the Democratic South. It is largely Republican, at least in national elections. Again, you can go back to the map. There it is. Only exception, Florida. Why Florida? It's got a lot of old people who depend on Social Security. It's got a lot of old people who moved from the north to Florida, including my brother and his family. It's got a lot of Latinos. Cuban Americans tend to be vote more Republican, but Latinos as a whole, at least 3-2, perhaps more, tend to vote Democratic. North Carolina, why North Carolina? Because of the emergence and growth of high-tech industries and the growth of the state and the movement of people from the north to North Carolina. But you can see this huge swath in the south. This includes West Virginia, of Republican states. This was exactly, if you go back 60 years, it looked exactly the opposite. These states would have all been blue. Every last one of them. So, what we have is then a much more competitive, nationally, a much more competitive party landscape that's relatively stable. Who finances the parties? Again, this is from the Center for Responsive Politics, and you can see the types of industries that tend to support the Democratic Party, the types of industries that support the Republican Party. You will find unions, for example, in the bottom 3, 10, 11, and 12 of the Democratic Party, and you'll see real estate very prominent in both, health prominent in both, and so on. As you might have guessed, money has become incredibly important in national campaigns, presidential campaigns. And I don't think the text talks about this, but I think it's worth mentioning. Campaign fundraising has, the need is to raise millions, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. Candidates for president, for the most part, while they're active in trying to raise funds, have supporters, important supporters, who go out and raise money for them. And these people are called bundlers. This has nothing to do with blankets. It has everything to do with money. So these websites, you can see who President Obama's bundlers were. What's the job of a bundler? A job of a bundler is to get campaign contribution commitments of $1 million plus from as many people and groups and organizations as possible. So if you want to begin to appreciate what, if any, differences there are amongst political candidates, presidential candidates, you could do worse than look at who's raising money for them. What very fabulously wealthy people are devoting their time and energy to raising money in the 7 and 8 figures for a candidate for president. So, the parties themselves. The parties tend to be coalitions, often uneasy, of diverse groups and interests. So in the Democratic Party, there are cultural and ideological divisions. There's some who are very liberal, there's some who are moderately liberal, and then there's some who are called blue dogs. Have you heard that term?
No.
Actually, a couple of the congressmen who were elected in Indiana, Democratic congressmen who were elected in 2012, were called blue dogs. A blue dog Democratic congressman is one who has been elected to Congress as a Democrat, but who represents either a very highly competitive district or one that leans slightly Republican. And so in 2012, there were a couple of Democrats elected from House districts in Indiana. from districts that might have been expected to vote Republican that didn't. And we'll talk about why that is at the end of the month. And they tend to vote in a very centrist way, halfway, more or less, halfway between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party members in the Congress, because they are representing much more conservative, politically conservative House districts than is the case for most members of the Democratic Party in Congress. So, of all of the people in Congress who are Democrats, quote-unquote blue dog Democrats, most of whom were wiped out in the last off-year elections, their votes are least controllable because they're worried about re-election. There are cultural divisions and political divisions within the Republican Party as well. There's the establishment Republicans, the Mitt Romneys of the world, the Jeb Bushes of the world, the evangelical Republicans, the Rick Santorums, the Governor Huckabees, and those. And then there are the libertarian, the Rand Paul type Republicans. So these are the three major groups, if you will, in the National Republican Party. Those that are focused on social issues tend to be in the evangelical wing of the party. Those focused on business support, business-oriented issues, tend to be the establishment piece of the party, and the libertarian-leaning tend to be business-oriented too, but they tend to be more liberal on social issues. And one of the things that has happened in both parties, Republican and Democrat, is that the number, and we'll talk about this later, is that the number of moderates in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has been dropping considerably. And one of the things you need to understand about the Congress, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about Congress, is that and you'll see some evidence of this in a minute, I think, in the party's activists generally. They tend to be more extreme politically. They tend to be the Democrats tend to be more liberal, the Republican activists and off-soldiers tend to be more politically conservatives, and then the party voters as a whole. And so that makes political compromise pretty difficult. Political parties are organizations, and they can be thought of as organizations with three different components: the party in the electorate, the party in the government, and the party organizations themselves. Now, I want to talk about each of these in turn. The party in the government is easiest, that is to say, just about everybody in national government who's been elected is either a Republican or Democrat. There are a few exceptions, but not many. And certainly in the Congress, governors, I think there's one governor who's an independent. State legislators are overwhelmingly either Republican or Democratic. And local governments, well, there are more local governments with nonpartisan elections. Party organizations themselves have national committees, state committees, county committees, city, ward, and precinct committees, and chairmen and women, and so on. These are non-governmental organizations, the party organizations. These are not, that they are elected in a sense by the members of the party who are active themselves. But they have elections internally, but but most of them are not voted on by the broader electorate. And then there's the party in the electorate, that is to say those who identify either as Republicans or Democrats or who register as such. So the party in the electorate is simply those people who are citizens who vote, who claim to have a party identification. And keep in mind that it's possible for people to vote a certain way and still not identify. So it's possible to say, I usually vote for all Republicans, but I don't identify with the Republican Party. I don't think of myself as a Republican. That's not impossible. Just as it's possible for somebody to say, I only vote for Democrats, but I don't consider myself a Democrat, identifying with the Democratic Party. It's possible. It's not likely, but possible. So the party in the electorate is just citizens who vote, and they tend to vote, those who vote for either one or the other. Then there are party organizations. We talked about that. The most visible part of national party organizations are the national conventions, the party platform, and primary elections and caucuses. Keep in mind that to a significant degree, elections are functions of, are organized by political party organizations. Not totally. State and federal has some. Usually states are more important. State government laws and regulations are more important than, much more significant, or not significant, but more frequent than national government regulations of elections. But though there are some. But political parties have a major role in how candidates elections are organized. And the state party organization, also they have a state convention, state committee, state chairperson, central committee, local leaders, party leaders, and so on. Most counties, for example, would have a county party and a county party executive director. And then there's the party in the government. The party in the government tries to organize and control governmental institutions. So, for example, when the Republicans took over the majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate as a consequence of the 2014 off-year elections, the majority leader in the Senate was no longer Harry Reid as of January 2015. It was Mitch McConnell. And the majority leader in the House of Representatives remained John Boehner of Ohio, because the Republicans had a majority of the seats in the House of Representatives. So which party has the majority in the governmental institution is very important in terms of how those institutions function. Partisanship plays an important role in national government, and divided government lessens that control. So that, for example, if the Congress is a Republican and the Democrats control the White House, then then their relationship may be everything from 100% conflictual to 100% collaborative. Needless to say, in these times, it's much closer to 100% conflictual than it is 100% collaborative. There are, however, limits of party unity, but there's good research out there that says party unity is stronger now, both for Republicans and Democrats, than ever before, that therefore party polarization in the Congress is greater now than at other times in our history, that blocking and obstruction, which is very frequent, prevention of consideration for presidential nominees, for positions, for court judgeships, more likely. So One of the things that majorities and large minorities can do, especially if they're unified, is to prevent things from happening. Again, keep in mind, it's always easier in American national government to stop something than it is to initiate a change. It's always that way. It doesn't matter what the change is. Again, you don't believe me? Ask yourself why the constitutional amendment to make flag burning illegal has never passed. Not even in the Congress. You don't know, and I don't know, one person who thinks it's a good idea to allow people to burn the flag. People find that offensive. That proposed constitutional amendment has never passed with a 2/3 majority in the House or the Senate. So it's easier to block than to pass legislation. One final point, that is the governors are active in using the federal system to try to shape public policy in their state, and it has implications in the country as well. So we are at slide 24, and I'm going to conclude here. And tomorrow we will probably have a shortened class, finishing doing a video lecture for the remainder of the party slides, which will probably be about, I don't know, 10 slides, something like that, maybe more. And we'll pick up tomorrow morning, 9:45. See you then.
I tried to print off like something from my next paper and something wrong. Yep. Okay. So you want to go to the library? I'm just like waiting right now to print on my document. Okay. I'll wait in here for you. Okay. And will you call Mr. Schrader and tell him I'll probably late? Well, that's not
I don't know his number.
Can I have like a task?
Yeah, I don't know his number.
Zachary Sheriff, please report to the office.